Today, Dr. Paul Gavoni, Paulie Gloves, is going to be joining us to speak about behaviors. He's an expert in human performance, coaching, and organizational leadership and has worked in education and human services for 20 years. He served in a variety of positions, including COO, leadership director, assistant principal, school turnaround manager, clinical coordinator, therapist, behavior analyst, and adjunct professor. Beyond his direct work with students in poverty and those suffering from behavioral and mental health issues, he specializes in providing administrative teams, teachers, and staff with training, coaching, and consultation with analyzing and developing behavior and performance management systems to positively impact key performance indicators. As a behavior scientist, Dr. Gavoni is passionate about applying organizational behavior management, OBM strategies, to establish positive environments that engage and bring out the best in people so they can bring out the best in the children that they serve or in the employees. Former fighter and Golden Gloves heavyweight coaching. He uses that science of human behavior to train fighters. He's also a Wall Street Journal and New York Times best-selling author. His specialty in human performance coaching and organizational leadership has had him working across education, human services, and sports for these 2 decades. I'm so glad to have him here. He's a board member of the World Behavior Analysis Day Alliance. He's known for his authenticity and practical approaches. It's a real treat to have him today on our podcast. He hosts several podcasts and is a sought-out speaker. So welcome, Paulie. We appreciate you being here today. For our podcast disclaimer, please visit the episode description. Thanks for coming back to What the Heck is Happening in HR. And I'm so excited to have Dr. Paulie Gavoni here today with me. And we're going to talk about new supervisors and what they could do to be able to help themselves and help their organization.
Thanks for having me back. It's always a joy to share knowledge about the science of human behavior. It's my passion.
So, in your book on Positional Authority Ain't Leadership, you mentioned several times how we need to focus on positive reinforcement. In fact, I think you used the ratio 4-to-1.
Yeah. Yeah.
Talk to me about why a 4-to-1, and is that something you'd recommend that supervisors put in, or what should they do? I become a new supervisor. How do I make an impact quickly?
Well, yes, absolutely. First of all, we have to all understand what positive reinforcement is. That's just something that's added as a result of behavior that increases the likelihood or strengthens the likelihood that behavior is going to occur again in the future. There are a lot of people who are well-intended that might be trying to reward people for something, but if it doesn't have an impact on behavior, then we wouldn't say it's actually a positive reinforcer. It's well-intended, but we can only measure it based on its impact on behavior. So that's number one we have to say. I think that probably the best analogy would be this. If you're showing up to an environment where somebody's only correcting you, right? They're telling you all the things that you're doing wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of us, everybody's doing stuff wrong all the time. I mean, there's a lot of things I can do better. I'm sure there's a lot of things you can do better. Who's perfect in this world, right? But if all people are doing is correcting your performance without recognizing the things that you've done well, right? Without shaping, what we call shaping, like taking a clay and molding it, right, to a desired level, that person, even though they might be well-intended, is going to become an aversive stimulus to you. They're going to be somebody that you don't want around. And so supervisors, you want to be people that are valued, right? It's people that are seen to help. And so when you recognize or you shape the things that people are doing well, and that doesn't mean it's just fluff. It's saying like, hey, this is great. It lets people know, here's what you're doing, and here's the results producing, right? Because it's got to be performance feedback, right? So they can align their behavior with positive outcomes. You establish yourself as a positive reinforcer, somebody that people want to be around. So when you do need to provide corrective feedback at this 4-to-1 ratio, they're going to be more likely to accept it and act upon it. And not that they want to act upon it otherwise, but they're not going to feel a way about it, right? Because if you do corrective feedback wrong, like if you do it publicly, if you overuse it, right? If the ratio is off with how often you are adding value or recognizing their value, people are going to start doing just enough to get by, and only when you're looking. And there's all sorts of other metrics that you're not seeing, like maybe they're performing less in these areas because they have fear of consequences for not doing this thing, right? So they become like, if you've ever been afraid of something, you get like tunnel vision, right? You just need to avoid this thing. And so the more afraid that they are of that consequence, or as you of a supervisor, if you are wielding negative reinforcement, the more likely you're going to have other metrics going in the wrong direction. And why do people do it? Well, it's a lot of good people are doing it because of the impact, the immediate impact they can see on behavior. I say, do this now. People jump and they do it. And they're like, well, this works. I can see this works. And immediacy of outcomes or immediacy of reinforcers have a large impact on the supervisor's behavior. But again, because they can't see or recognize the other impact, the impact on the morale, these things that you can't see, or future performance or future retention, then it just comes at a large expense. And so I strongly recommend you stay away from that. And also, it's not a zeros and one thing. You can't give positive reinforcement. Let's say somebody values praise, right? And they're only going to value your praise if they respect you, if they like you, they want you around. It has to be authentic. I had somebody one time that I was working with a leader who was very coercive. I talk about this in my book. I talk about my own shame, right? How I engaged in my own ass clown behaviors because I was seeing people being just abused, for lack of a better term. Maybe abuse is not the right word, but they were really being spoken down to. It's not the way that somebody with positional authority should be speaking to other people. And so finally I'd had it, and I confronted the person. And I remember the individual broke down in tears, and I was just so upset. I said, I don't even believe those tears. They're crocodile tears, because they said that they had counted how many times they praised somebody. They praised people the day before. It was like, I praised people 15 times. I'm like, the fact that you even have to count it, it's like just not a value of yours, I don't think, It's people have to experience it sincerely. And if they don't, if you've ever had somebody praise you and you felt it was insincere, you'd rather not have that. It becomes aversive to you. So I think that's the point. But they also, of course, have to deliver it correctly, right? They have to be very specific about what they're doing, what they're praising or reinforcing, and aligning with some outcome, because we want the outcome to take over as the reinforcer, right? We want people to do it because it's producing something of value. Their job's easier. They feel good about the product, produces the customer's happier, whatever it is, right? We want that to take over. So the supervisor is there to bridge that gap.
Talk a little bit about this being specific. I find that feedback many times is just this vague blanket statement. Maybe they say it in passing rather than the specificness of the behavior they're trying to continue. So, or they're trying to reinforce and continue. So, talk about that and what that means and what that might look like in an organization.
Yeah, well, number one, we have a term in OBM we call pinpointing, right? And pin's not a scientific term, but it suggests precision. So you always start with a pinpoint result, right? What result you want to achieve? And then we pinpoint the behaviors, all right? What behaviors do people need to engage in that are going to achieve this result? So when we're giving feedback to people, we don't want to say you did a good job on something. That might feel great, and you might be sincere about it. But in terms of improving performance, it's not necessarily going to have an impact on it because people don't know what that means, that they did a good job. What did they do a good job about? And especially if it's like a new behavior or something somebody's learning. Like my fighters are engaging in lots of behaviors, right? If it's new, let's say they were pivoting on their back foot. I might say like, man, I love that you pivot on your back foot. Did you notice when you pivot on your back foot that you got more extension, that, you generated some more power, whatever it is. And I'm helping them see that when you engage in this behavior, here's the result that it's producing. Now, I might do that early on, but I'm going to shift my feedback to asking them to pinpoint their own behavior and the impacts of it, right? I shift from telling to asking because this is how we avoid that prompt dependency we talked about earlier. And by the way, if any of you listening to this have used the GPS to go to the same place over and over and over again, it means you're prompt dependent on a GPS. Why is that? Because the GPS has told you what to do and you haven't had to think for yourself. Neuroscientists might say strengthening your neural pathways, neuroplasticity and all that stuff that I'm not that familiar with. We would just say it's about strengthening habits. And to do that, you have to think for yourself, right? You have to identify discriminate things in the environment to tell you the things that you should be doing. Nobody's coming out saying go left, go right, go the other, unless
Mm-hmm.
it's GPS. But when you're able to do that on your own, you have a lot more success. So, it comes back down to that we have to be very specific about behaviors and the outcomes, and we shift from telling to asking. We want people to reflect on their behavior, the outcomes that are occurring.
So, new supervisor, definitely using specific positive reinforcement. Let's say they've been promoted, and under them is a supervisor who feels that he got the job done without all this praise. Why does everybody need a trophy every time they just do their job? And how do we persuade that person? How's that new manager persuade that person who says, I don't need this?
Yeah, I like to do it through storytelling. I have this happens a lot in education, right? Where teachers say they should just want to learn. Kids should want to learn to learn. I'm like, great. If they want to do that math, if they want to do that reading, that's value. That is perfect. No, then you don't need to reward anything in between, right? But if they don't value it, the best thing you can do is put on your leading hat, right? And help them to create value. But if you still can't create value for that, then that student's going to do just enough to get by and only when you're looking, right? You're not going to get the best out of them. And so this is why we want to have some sort of contrived reinforcer in between to keep their behavior going well enough or long enough, because we know without a doubt, without a shadow of a doubt, that with the exception of reflexes, behavior occurs because of reinforcement. And there's two types of reinforcement: negative reinforcement, which is fear of consequences when we're talking about performance improvement here. And when you use negative reinforcement, it means people will do just enough to get by and only when you're looking. The same way that most of us do the speed limit, right? We do it to avoid getting a ticket, and we do it typically when the cops, present. Otherwise, we're pushing the limit. But when we get people in touch with positive reinforcement, there are things added as a result of their behavior. People are going to keep doing things even when you're not looking. They're going to be much more likely to go above and beyond. So it's powerful to understand that. And so, that person who's doing that, hey, they might be having some sort of success. But as their supervisor, I say, you know what? Let's just try this. If I can get them to behave well enough and long enough, and they see that their supervisees are performing better, that would
Mm-hmm.
be likely be a
Mm-hmm.
naturally occurring positive reinforcer of some kind, and that's going to take over. So I want to really reinforce people into doing these things. So I want to equip them with the knowledge and skills. I want to get them to behave well enough and long enough and help that supervisor see the impact of their behavior. So the principles go up the chain, right?
Mm-hmm.
To bring out the best in the frontline employee, you got to bring out the best in supervisor. To bring out the best in supervisor, you got to bring out the best in the manager. And then we just go up the chain. The
Mm-hmm.
behavior principles thankfully cascade, right? And they go back and forth. They're not, they're omnidirectional. They're not
Right.
unidirectional. We all operate under the same behavior principles.
Well, certainly some of the tools that we need to be successful in life and at work is in your latest book of Positional Authority Ain't Leadership. Thank you so much, Polly, for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure to be on. Thanks so much for having me.